I think that the perfect after lunch conversation is one that helps you digest the morning's activities. Ha ha ha. And so, what we've talked about last night, and Felicia's wonderful fault lines presentation from this morning, and also Sudeep's comments about our careers and how we shape our careers and how we plan for our careers. I can't think of a better person to get us started than Kenneth Cooper. You can read his bio on our website. You can learn more about him. I've had the opportunity to know him now for about 30 years. But what I wanted for you to note and to sort of digest and absorb in this conversation is the fact that Ken has known no boundaries in his career in terms of, I can't be this, I can't do that. He's been a foreign correspondent. He was the national editor at the Boston Globe. He's was a reporter at the Washington Post. The man has not allowed himself to be put in a box and shoved away in a corner. And I might even want to ask you to start with that compliment you said that someone paid to you years ago when they were complaining about, how do I use my identity in the newsroom or whatever. But let's listen to Ken Cooper sort of guide us through that headline that I put for this speech. When the BIPOC challenge, when you're a person of color in the newsroom, and the challenge is that your lived experience is given the side eye. You're either thought to be not objective or it's not given any relevance. So, Ken, why don't you get us started on that conversation?
Okay, thanks, Rachel. I want to start by just amplifying one point that Sudeep made, just as I walked into the room. And he said something I say all the time. I'm an editor at GBH, News in Boston, an NPR and PBS station, and I have some hiring responsibilities. And when I hire people and I evaluate them, I'm taking my measure of the quality of their mind and how smart they are. And Sudeep has his way of doing it, but that's particularly what I do when I interview people. I want to see and sense that they're thinking about their answers. People who come in with sort of glib answers don't do a lot for me. But I really want to emphasize that. And it was interesting to me that I told my fellow editors at GBH that this was my hiring strategy. And not to brag, but I got like 100% track record right now. They were surprised by that. Like it had never occurred to them. But that's the first thing I'm looking for, because you may have had this skill, you may have had that experience, but if you're a smart, thinking individual, I can train you to do whatever you haven't done or don't know how to do yet. I just wanted to add that. The compliment that Rachel referred to happened some years ago. It was in the 90s, maybe early 2000s when I learned of it. But I have a friend here who was a former radio reporter, African-American woman, who has been in PR for some years. And she was telling me she was talking to some young African-American journalists. And I could kind of infer from her comment and her compliment what she was talking to them about. And I think this is perhaps the greatest compliment ever given to me, notwithstanding the Pulitzer Prize, because it goes not just to profession and professionalism, but also goes to personal integrity. And in sort of scolding or lecturing these young African-American journalists, this is what she said. She said, "Look at Mike Frisby." At that point, he was the the White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I had dinner with him last night. She said, "Look at Mike Frisby. Look at Ken Cooper. They own their identity and they're successful." I think she was trying to tell these young people, look, you don't have to cede your identity to be a success in journalism. And I've always thought that was a price too high and unreasonable. And when I've trained journalists of color, I've always tried to teach them to own their identity and model that and embrace their community. And the reason for that, first of all, I mean, it's a hell of a thing to have a job, you gotta cede your identity. I mean, what kind of rational sense does that make? But the fact of the matter is, everybody else in the business gets to be who they are. Race, ethnicity, religion. One of the examples I told Rachel about, I have a young reporter, youngish, Italian-American who works for me now and has worked for me for a few years. And you know, in radio, we do what we call an audio edit. I see some NPR tags, so you know the drill. I read the host lead. I don't read the script. The reporter starts reading the script, plays the track, cut actuality, read script, like that. And I learned, I'm relatively new to radio, that I can listen and concentrate better if I close my eyes. So I had my eyes closed, and I'm listening to this Italian-American reporter read a script and play his tracks, his acts. And then a name popped up. And it sounded like the name of somebody he quotes a lot, and I was trying to figure out what is that guy doing in this story. It didn't seem to fit. And he went through the script, and then at that point, I opened my eyes and I read the script. And I noticed that the name that I mistook was Cardinale. And I was thinking it was Carnivale. And I had said, Cardinale, Carnivale, those are Italian-American names. And I looked at my reporter and said, what is this? A paisan in every story? And, you know, he kind of laughed, I kind of laughed too. And I wasn't really faulting him, but here's a guy, he's an Italian-American, he embraces his identity, spent some time in Italy as a student, college student, and learned some Italian. And literally since then, it's not like every story has an Italian-American in it, but it's a lot. And part of it is, with his positive self-identification with his ethnicity, Italian-Americans, he doesn't do it gratuitously, in his beat, tell him stuff. And sometimes they're Italian-Americans in somewhat strange places. He was covering the Harvard admissions trial where their way of doing admissions is under assault. And one of the lawyers representing the anti-affirmative action side was an Italian-American. But Paisan was talking to Paisan, and GBH benefited. So he gets to embrace his identity and own his identity. Why can't we? I'll give you another example. When I was at the Washington Post and I was on the national staff, it wasn't this way when I started, but it so happened at a certain point, most of the editors on the national desk were Jewish. Got to be a little bit of a problem on Jewish holidays, which as a reporter I thought was kind of hilarious. They didn't figure out how to handle that. But on the day that Al Gore picked Joseph Lieberman to be his running mate, vice presidential running mate, I noticed the Jewish editors on the national desk were just buzzing, they're happy, you know, they're chatting, you know, just very ebullient. And my editor at that time was a Jewish guy. And he came over to talk to me about whatever. And I sort of observed to him, I said, I noticed over there on the national desk, everybody seems to be really happy today. And it was funny, he kind of like swallowed his grin and his, you know, upbeat look. I said, it's okay. It's okay. And what I didn't say, but what I was trying to sit up and say, it's okay for us to be us too, all right? So everybody else owns their identity in the newsroom, you know. Everybody should be allowed to do that, and everybody should have the space to do that, and it should be valued. Everybody talks to diversity rap these days. It's the 21st century, so that's a real thing. It's not a concept anymore. So that's one of the strong messages I have, is that to own your identity, and compel people to value your identity and what you bring. As an editor at GBH, where my responsibilities for assigning education stories, higher ed and K-12, I have a reporter who covers the majority minority neighborhoods of the city, Dorchester being one. We call it the Dorchester Bureau. Jerry Yo back there told me he's from Dorchester. And I have a young Latino reporter who covers the intersection of sport and culture. And, I sit also in the leadership ranks of the newsroom, where we decide what we're going to do today, what we're going to cover today, how we're going to cover, planning bigger projects. So I'm always at that table. And there are times surrounded by white, college-educated, suburban editors, my colleagues, I feel like an alien in the room. And, it kind of took me a while to figure out why. I'm a journalist, I'm college-educated, I'm not white, and I don't live in the suburbs, I live in the city. And the reason is this: many of them cannot see beyond their own experience. They can't, or they won't, or they don't. And it's true for people of color who are successful for the most. If you're successful, I'm gonna tell you, sort of like my college mentor told me at Washington University in St. Louis, if you're gonna be successful and you're a person of color in this society where we are minorities numerically, you have to do a good job of decoding what white people say and what they mean. So a little bit goes back to Du Bois, W. Du Bois. We just don't see the world through our own eyes, but we also have this consciousness of how we're being seen by other people. And many white people, including my colleagues, most of them, go through the world only seeing the world through their, in this case, white, suburban, college-educated eyes, and don't realize there are other ways of seeing and being. Even if abstractly they know, and this comes up in a lot of different ways. And I first actually realized this sort of sense of alienness and what it was about. I'm in charge of education coverage, and there was a bill pending in the Massachusetts legislature that was something like mandate a minimum of 15 minutes of recess in K-12 schools. And they were so excited about this legislation and doing a story about it, and it kept bringing it up and up and up. And I'm not that interested. And it actually helped me that I had a very talented Latina reporter covering K-12 education at that point, so talented that the Boston Globe stole her. Those talent thieves. But I had mentioned to her, sort of musing, I don't understand why these other editors are so excited about this recess story, mandatory recess. And she put her finger on it, or helped me get to understand. She says, that's because you, me, am thinking about the whole system. They are thinking about their children. They're overstressed children, overstressed because their parents are stressing them and trying to, with these aspirations that are over the top and the demands on their time. And, a light went off in my head. So eventually, they did that story, somebody else, not one of my, I wasn't going to devote my reporter's time to doing that story. And when she said I was thinking about the system, we didn't have a K-12 desk when I arrived there. We created one with grant funding. And the then general manager said, okay, I'm gonna put you in charge of this. And then he said something about what he wanted the mission to be that I thought showed he hadn't really thought through, all right, what the mission should be. And, it took this Latino reporter and I a little while to sort of figure out what we wanted to do. But what we figured out, and this is one of the reasons the Globe stole her, they were going to have her do the same thing I decided to have her do. So that in Massachusetts, and this applies to many states, well, the first part not. Massachusetts got the best K-12 test scores in the entire country of any state. And this part applies in many places, but there are these huge gaps in the achievement of Black and Latino students down here and white and Asian students up here. And the fact of the matter is our country is becoming more of color. Our Commonwealth of Massachusetts is becoming more of color. And I decided that, where we needed to focus public attention, and this is the way I said it, on the kids who are behind. And it's not just Black and Latino, but that included special needs kids, kids learning English, most of them going from Spanish to English, but not all of them. And in some contexts, like STEM fields, girls. And so with that view, I am not thinking, and I'm thinking about that, I say, well, those kids who are behind, the last thing they need is more time off. They don't need recess so much. I don't think their parents give my kid recess so they can catch up. And that was when it dawned on me that, they really have difficulty. And there's some cues too. You'll find this in newsrooms. You'll find white editors, maybe sometimes reporters. Everyone is talking about, everyone is doing thus and such. And whenever you hear everyone,
it's not going to include you.
Yeah. Is it really everyone? And I guarantee you in almost every circumstance it really isn't. And you sort of have to interject to say, no, it's not everyone. If we're going to tell that story, how about these people who are not into that or not thinking that?
I don't want to interject or interrupt your flow, but something just really popped into my mind, and I mentioned it earlier when I talked about Ray's remark last night when he said that when he was at PBS NewsHour, anytime he would pronounce a name using the Latino pronunciation or whatever, people would write in and call in and complain, and it was like he was offending them. He was doing something deliberately to upset them or to usurp. So what I want to ask you is, particularly in this last 2 years in America, where we've seen a lot of stuff unmasked, a lot of hard, cold realities, as a Black man in the newsroom, are you put in a position sometimes of wanting to, I don't know how to put this delicately.
Put it indelicately then.
Are you ever put in the position of wanting to say, you just don't get it, or that's not the way Black America is feeling, or I feel? Are you ever having to insert who you are even more in some tough discussions?
Yeah. I think you're referring to the period since George Floyd and
everything that's been happening in America in the past couple of years.
The period when, let me be careful. We had a certain president that seemed to know how to do his job. That's the most neutral thing I can say about it.
I forgot about the 4 years of Trump. See, I just wiped that out of my mind.
Yeah, I did. And it was kind of a curious circumstance because, and this exposes a little trade secret here about GBH. We basically don't have anybody staff to cover the news on Friday nights and all day Saturday. And the very first George Floyd protest in Boston occurred on a Friday evening. And there was awareness of it. Other stuff was going on. You could say in retrospect there was the editor in charge underestimated the significance. So we didn't cover the very first protests. And there was a lot of teeth gnashing about it. But the response was to cover every single protest iteratively. And I said on numerous occasions, I mean, what's going to be new at this particular protest? And would say, what we really need to do is dig into the conditions that give rise to the protests. The protests are on the surface. It makes everybody feels good like they were the program they woke. But really, to get to the core of things, we need to dig beneath the surface and look at why. And we still haven't done this to my satisfaction. For example, and I've looked at these numbers, if you just look at black and white in Boston and who earns how much by educational level, high school graduates, black and white, about the same amount of money. They have a 2-year degree from community college, about the same. I mean, it's a marginal difference in whites. You have a bachelor's degree. White bachelor's degree holders earn $10,000 a year more. That's real money. And you go up a level to the master's degree, white master's degrees holders earn $30,000 a year more. Why is that? You know? And it was things like that I was pushing for us to take a look at. And the investigating team did some things that had mostly to do with government contracting. And we got a new, since COVID, general manager, and I've been pushing for us to have a reporter cover what I want to call it, cover structural racism. She's a little uncomfortable with that, so she said cover race and racism. And I said, I don't care what we call it, as long as what they're writing about and covering is structural racism. And it's systemic, because anytime you have a situation where the same results occur over and over time and over place, that's a system, and that's structural.
One of the best quotes I've ever heard in recent years was, "The system is not broken. The system is working exactly as it was intended to work in this country." It just was profound for me, and it literally shifted all of my thinking about covering poverty issues, maternal health, all the things that I'm interested in. Look at that from that perspective. It opens up a whole new realm of reporting.
It does. And I think we are drafting a grant proposal to have a reporter cover racism after about 1.5 years delay. And I'll just say, I may not be around to see it implemented because I'm 66. My first Social Security check arrived last week.
It's looking good to you.
And no, I'm not working forever. No, I'm not working till I'm 70. But I hope they get them set it up. And I'm being a little vague here because I haven't told my employer exactly of my plans yet.
Oops. That's a deep background. So let's talk about that term, lived experience. Some people have such of a challenge with it. They think everybody has a lived experience. If I was born in a mansion, that was my lived experience. But you can think about it from so many different perspectives. When you were at the Post back in the 80s, and again, looking at the challenges of whatever the social conditions were at the time, and now, 40 years later, we're still dealing with some of the same sorts of issues. So how do we use that lived experience in a situation where some consider it not to be objective, or you lose your objectivity if you think or focus too much on these types of things?
Again, why does that only apply to us? My new general manager, as it'll be 2 years in July, is a white woman, younger than me, and she's promoted and hired a lot of white women. And one of them, she moved into the senior editor ranks. Almost every time we have a discussion about stories, she's proposing a story about women or women's issue. And I don't have a problem with that. A little bit, because she don't have no reporters to do stuff, so she's trying to come up with ideas for somebody else's reporters to do, which I'm not quite so sure she should be in that room if she don't have responsibilities for reporters. But anyway, they do that. And everybody does have a lived experience. The problem, again, going back to, can't see beyond your own experience, they think their lived experience is the sum total of everybody's lived experience, and it ain't so. I'll give you another example when this came up, and it had a little effect on our coverage. There was a proposition that California had done this first, that poor chickens laying eggs, they don't have so much room to move around, so we need a state law to mandate that chickens have so much room to move around while they're laying eggs.
The Chicken Condo Law, just in case you hadn't heard of it.
And
that was a joke.
My colleagues were really excited again about this. And I said, well, hold up. And this is from my experience. Hold up. I wanted to say, but I didn't want to diss them too much. I want to say, I don't give a shit about the chickens. If I could have been, forthright, that's what I would have said. Those chickens wouldn't exist if there wasn't a human demand for their eggs. What I did say is what I do care about is eggs are a cheap source of protein. And I'm concerned about the low-income mother with children being able to afford that cheap source of protein. And the reason I felt that and said that, because I was that kid at one point with my mother and her 4 kids. And her grocery list in a little notebook, one of those little miniature spiral notebooks, was so specific it went down to the cents. So many cans of green beans at this is in the 60s, 33 cents a can or whatever. And I did assign a reporter who did that story. It did not make a difference in the outcome, the ballot and the referendum. But, that was a class and kind of race thing where they,
I want to read that story. Would you send us a link to it?
I will. They got more room. And, I think the implementation has been delayed. So it's yet unclear how much the price is going to go up, but it's going to go up. And, that's a clear place for my lived experience. I put it on the table. I didn't explain all of that about my mother and her kids, but, that's the place it came from, The other, at that time there was one other African American manager in my newsroom, and she's up from the projects in New York City. All right. I never lived in the projects, but she's got a different point of view about a lot of stuff that comes up, because of that. And, if you grew up in a suburban white family and there's always enough for everybody and everything, just about, including the extras and the luxuries, it's really a little hard for you to put yourself in the shoes of people who have kids, want to do right by them, but ain't enough money for food, for clothes, or not enough money all the time, you know what I mean? It's a different perspective. And certainly, somebody who grew up poor and white could have that perspective to a certain extent. But those people are largely absent from newsrooms too, So, I value my lived experience, and I'm in a position at GBH where actually I have more impact on the overall product than I ever did before. When I was national at the Globe, I'm running the national section, but I don't really have too much to do with the Metro section or the sports section. I might make a suggestion here and there, but here I can dip in and suggest anything. And sometimes I just make it happen. If my fellow editors don't embrace the suggestion, I just make it happen.
We're going to open it up to questions soon, but I wanted to ask you also, someone mentioned earlier today about the imposter syndrome that sometimes journalists of color can have. A lot of times it's because simply you are the only one, and quite frankly, you're made to feel like you don't belong. What would you say about journalists who may be battling with that?
Well, the first thing I would say is it's utterly ridiculous in the 21st century to be what I call the lonely only anywhere. It's ridiculous. And I actually left an impression on this relatively new GM, because when she came in, one of the things I said to her, I said, when I came to this newsroom, there were 4 Latinos in the newsroom. Now there's one, the one who works for me. I didn't say it was ridiculous out loud, but she kind of got the point. And she's done some hiring. I think we're back up to 4, which still is not a great number. And only one of them is a full-fledged reporter. And 2 of the 4 work for me. One is a production assistant that I was just regretting the other day that working remotely, I haven't been able to contribute as much to her development as if we were in a newsroom and, just casual conversations. But as far as the imposter part, I've been in this business 45 years, next month. And I run into a lot of imposters in the newsroom. And the vast majority of them were not of color. When I went to work at the Boston Globe in the early 1980s, 1980 exactly, there were a bunch of older white men, reporters. We used to call them the World War II crowd. There was something wrong with them, that they didn't get drafted and go to war. Uniformly, mediocre white men, uniformly. There's some imposters there. The children of the friends of, everybody to maintain a place in the newsroom sooner or later, because regimes can change, has to demonstrate they belong in the newsroom. Should have to. And in a different context, I once said to a white guy who actually grew up poor in the housing projects in South Boston, and he was working for a presidential candidate, and I was covering that candidate. And I said to him at one point, I said, look, I'm black, you're white, we're on the same airplane. who do you think worked harder to get here? And the answer was obvious to him. Even him, who grew up poor in the housing projects in South Boston. So I don't think we should go for the okie-doke. It's a psychological game, just like the angry black person stereotype, you know. It's like we never have a right to be angry. What kind of human doesn't ever get angry, you know? I mean, I think what we have to be careful, and this is one of the things I want to make clear, you know, you're going to run into racism in your newsrooms. And you have to calibrate carefully your response. You know, I know calling people out is a big thing nowadays with young people. I call them out. And that may sometimes be the appropriate response. But I would urge you that when confronted with such, take a breath, take a minute, and calibrate your response so that your response doesn't end up harming you and your career, and you get your point across. And things have changed a lot, you know. I won't tell the whole story now, but in my very first job in the daily newspaper, I had a racist white boss who at times would turn his back to me and call me the N-word under his breath.
Right there.
Under his breath. Now, how do I know that if he had his back turned? Well, and this is one of my other points I want to make, you need allies in this business. I knew that because in that suburban bureau, there were 8 reporters. 6 of them were young white women because the paper had been sued for sex discrimination, and their response was to stack a bunch of white women at the bottom of the pyramid. There was me, who had replaced a black woman in the bureau, and there was a token white man. So they told me. And now nowadays, something like that happened, you could run to HR and complain. But that wasn't even a concept back then. And, you know, there was an occasion in June of 1978 when the Supreme Court made a decision about affirmative action called the Bakke decision, which at that time in communities of color and the civil rights community was considered a big defeat. And my racist boss, who, by the way, I was in St. Louis, Missouri. He was from Long Island, New York. He's on the phone and he's cheering, and it's the news of the day that the Bakke decision came down, you know. And then he turns to me with the phone and says, "Yeah, I'm going to the country club tonight to celebrate." He's taunting me. And my first response appeared in my head. And that response was, I had him up against the wall with both my hands around his throat, choking the shit out of him. But I also realized I had a part-time temporary job from which I could be fired without cause on 2 weeks' notice. And so what I did is I got up from my seat and I walked out. I left. And actually one of the white women, my colleagues, followed me out the room because she was attuned enough to grasp what was happening. And she tried to calm me down and said, well, let's go get a copy of the decision and read it so we understand it, which we did. And it turns out that the Bakke decision now is what affirmative action in college admissions hangs on. Question?
You will be the one that loses a job for how you react and not the person who said the racial slur or something racist. Like, doesn't that create a sort of internal struggle that you have to do where you're thinking, I don't want to lose my job because my coworker was racist?
Yeah, you know, that's why I didn't beat his ass. I wanted to many times. It wasn't so much in struggle. I knew he was wrong. And one of the other things, and I had been warned before I went to work for him that he was a racist. There were a couple of things I did to sort of cope with him, and it was stressful. And that's when I started jogging, specifically to manage the stress of dealing with this dude. But one of the things I would do, since he's a racist, I kind of know what's in his head. And he was a short guy. And, you know, I'm a thin, taller guy at that point, 40 pounds lighter. But, you know, when he really got on my skin a lot, I would get into his space just a little bit, into his personal space. Because I'm thinking he's a racist, so he's going to think I got a knife or a gun and I'm going to shoot his ass. I stab him. And every time I violated his space just a little bit, he'd get this nervous look. He'd cut his eyes over at me, and then he'd look back, and then he'd calm the hell down. Now, I do want to say one thing, but there's no men of color in here who are really big, but I have had conversations with really big black men who know and have adapted so that they're careful about how close they get to white people in the newsroom, because they're scaring them when they don't mean to, and there's no reason to be scared. But in this case, I was trying to scare this dude. And the other thing I'll say about him, he was the kind of guy who lost all grace under pressure. And actually, when your white colleagues get under pressure, that's when you're going to see their true colors come out. And he would lose grace, and he would yell and scream. And I was maybe sitting from here to Rachel from him. And he would yell and scream at me. This was in the typewriter days. This IBM's electric. I'd just keep typing. And then he'd walk over to me, and in a simple, normal tone of voice, say something like, "Ken, would you call Maplewood and find out what's on the agenda for the city council meeting tonight?" "Oh, sure, Mike, no problem." But I was training him to modify his behavior, that if he yelled at me, I don't hear you. I'm not going to respond. And it worked. I managed. It didn't create an internal conflict with me. He's lucky it didn't create an external conflict, though. And I'm lucky, too, because I'd have got fired. That's the way it would have went.
We want to sneak in if there are any other urgent questions. Torrance.
So you were a reporter at the time, and then you transitioned to management. Can you just talk about that transition? Did you have mentors or anybody that gave you the idea? Were there battles where people didn't see your value or think you were qualified enough? Can you talk about your journey transitioning from reporter to management?
Yeah, that wasn't part of my plan, quite frankly. I'm not like Sudeep. I never actually wanted to be an editor. And when I was at the Washington Post in the 90s, not the 80s, but I got, inquiries about being an assistant national editor, assistant metro editor, assistant forward editor. And quite frankly, I usually had the same response. Read my lips. I do not want to be an editor. But I got to the point where I'd kind of run out my string at the Washington Post after 12 years. And I had a friend who was a ranking editor at the Boston Globe, and he's my friend. He's hearing my frustrations. And Greg Moore kind of sweet-talked me into becoming national editor of the Globe. It wasn't really fair, because he knew more about me as for our friendship. And quite frankly, I had done just about everything I thought I could do at the Post. I wanted to be an op-ed columnist, but I kind of was reading the tea leaves that there was somebody else who was likely on that track, somebody else black who I respected. So, and I know the way they think, at least they were thinking then, is like, we got one, we got one. So I decided to leave. And before I left, in my career, I sort of make these leaps. And then when I get over there, I said, oh shit, what I got myself into? And I went to see a couple of black editors of the Washington Post said, man, I got this job as national editor of the Globe. So how do you be an editor? How do you do this thing being an editor? And I got some good advice from Milton Coleman, who told me, and I think this is his exact quote, he said, the better part of editing occurs before the copy comes in. The better part of editing occurs before the copy comes in. And when he described the process, I appreciated that's what my white editor, had done for me. Story concept. Editor and reporter discuss what the concept is. Sort of mid-course check-in by the editor. Because, you know, the reporter may have learned different information that changed the direction of the story. Some hypothesis in the beginning may have been wrong. And then the third check-in should be just before the reporter starts to write, to talk through what they got, how to shape it. So you do all that coaching, then actually the tactile line editing part is easier. If you don't do all that coaching, you're really not editing. I call that, you know, correcting papers. Because after it's written, you know, barring sending the reporter back, there's not much more they can do. So that's how I wound up being an editor. And I got into business because I wanted to write. I was never had an ambition to be an editor-in-chief of a newspaper. My friend Greg Moore, he had that ambition. He became editor-in-chief of the Denver Post. And I suppose my friend Kevin Merida, you know, had that ambition, and that's how he winds up at the LA Times. But it, you know, never was my thing. The thing I do like about it, there's two things. I like the autonomy, and I like, at this stage of my career, mentoring and coaching young journalists.
You said you were talking about how, like, you've been the one loner in the room from time to time. Like, how important do you think it is for young journalists of color to seek opportunities towards management? Because I know a lot of reporters I talk to, like, no way, I don't want to deal with that. It's too stressful. I don't want that responsibility. Do you feel like we should open our perspective up a little more towards
Yes,
that?
I do agree with that.
And why, if you think so?
Because who's in the room and who's at the table makes a big difference in who and what gets done. And, you know, it can be what we do in addition to what we don't do. And I'll tell this story quickly. You know, I was at the Boston Globe. I'm national editor, and, you know, we have our pitch meeting in the morning where we say what we have coming for that day. And this particular day, and quite frankly, when the editors were pitching, half the time I'm a little tuned out. I'm thinking about how I'm going to implement what I got to do today. And because I'm not the audience. The editors-in-chief is the audience, right? But one day I heard the Metro editor say, we're going to do this story on why these black and Latino kids can't learn what they need to learn to pass the MCAS. The MCAS is the state mandated test that you have to pass to graduate in Massachusetts. And I was like, and what I heard in my head was something that an openly racist member of the Boston School Committee said in the 60s when the local NAACP was demanding that they desegregate the schools. And this white member of the school committee said this, almost, I think these are the exact words, we don't have inferior schools. We have inferior children. He said that. And that's what I heard this good white liberal editor say. And my response was, well, I think you're asking the wrong question. The question is, why aren't the teachers teaching black and Latino kids what they need to know to pass the test? We know all children can learn. I put that in there too, because that's a premise of every education reform going back to Daddy Bush. And I was actually prepared to throw my body in front of that story to make sure it never got in the paper, and it didn't. But, and this is the other thing, these things can come with a cost. I made an enemy. because he's an insecure white man. And that, he couldn't see my criticism of this one story idea as that and not a criticism of him. I could have made it him. I didn't call him, so-called liberal or anything like that. I just said, no, you asked the wrong question. And the editor-in-chief, by the way, whose name you would all recognize probably, didn't say anything, which I thought was interesting. So there was a cost. But in the end, my feeling was, why am I here at the table if not for this? To push what needs to go and to block. I regarded that concept, can't learn, can't. I regard that as defamation of my people and Latinos. That's defamation. Can't learn. He didn't say, why aren't they learning? Why can't they learn? And I said, oh my goodness. But anyway.
We're going to continue this conversation with Ken Cooper, and I'm keeping fully aware of the fact that the next time we'll probably be on Zoom on a cruise ship, but that's okay. We need you in this cohort. We need the perspective, the insight, the advice, the guidance of someone who has, again, literally opened the doors for all of us to be sitting here in this room. So I'd like to take this moment to thank you for accepting our invitation and ask us all to please stay in touch with us. And as I say, some of these folks in here can use your advice and insights.